We're joined now by Dr. Bimal Jalan, former RBI governor and former chief economic advisor, member of Rajya Sabha. Thank you so much, Dr. Jalan, for joining us. Your quick take on what do we see the macroeconomic picture at the moment? We've just received good news on the WPI front as well. So we've had good news on CPI and WPI as well as IIP. So does it seem that on the economic front, the government has a lot to cheer, even as the bipolar results suggest that on the political front, they're not really reaping the results of that as yet? Dr. Jalan?
No. But I mean, yes. I mean, things are improving definitely. I mean, of that there is no doubt. Investment is also up. The corporate sector is investing more, and so these are all positive signs compared with, say, 6 months ago, as of now.
Are you worried about what's happening on the external front? We've seen Trump making a lot of protectionist noises, and increasingly there is this talk of tit for tat. There was a general view that poor export growth was what is holding back India's growth, and now we see rising protectionism. Then we cannot hope for exports to come to our rescue. So are you in the camp that believes exports are a huge factor, or do you think that India has sufficiently large domestic market and exports are but incidental to the overall growth story, sir?
No. I mean, the two are not interrelated. I mean, in the sense that exports for India are important, but the most important point to remember is that protectionism abroad, I mean, such as it is as of now, I mean, doesn't affect our export potential to the same extent as maybe in industrial countries. The reason for it is simply that a percentage of our exports as a percentage of GDP and so on is not very high as compared with, say, the rest of some of the East Asian countries and so on. So that's part we must remember. And exports have to be given maximum advantage, which we are doing also in some ways. So I don't see that the so-called protectionism abroad. Of course, it would affect certain types of exports and certain goods and services, but I don't think that there is any large problem. I mean, the most important problem is in a different area, which is the immigration policies for the people of India to, say, engage in jobs which may not be paying the kind of money that US has asked for. You see what I mean? I mean, there is a mixed story, but I am absolutely sure that we can cope with it.
It was the end of multilateralism, sir, because increasingly the US particularly wants to go the bilateral or the plurilateral way, because that is where they can exert their their strength, as it were, and arm twist other countries into agreeing. So even though we have the mini ministerial coming up next week in Delhi, are we setting too much store by it, and should we really write off the WTO, or is it early days yet?
No, it's what you are right. I mean, absolutely in sort of emphasizing that protectionism in the US is something which has to be prevented, because it's the largest economy in the world at the moment, and in terms of global trade, etc., it has a very important role. And European Union, it has picked up a bit, but still it's not functioning exactly the same way as it was expected to function. Then you have Brexit. So these are negative signs, as it were, and how it would develop over future, I mean, with that we have to wait and see. So protectionism in the US and similarly Brexit, similarly European Union, that the Union as such is not functioning as well as it was expected to by now. Well, these are issues which we have to cope with. But the most important point from our point of view is that India, all said and done, is not as dependent on trade as some of the other countries are. So the impact is not going to be as strong as many of the other developing countries may face. So I'm optimistic, as you can see.
Reason to be, but even as we speak,
the situation,
even as we speak about the economic recovery, is it time for us to start worrying? And are you a little worried about the fact that bank credit, just when it was showing signs of picking up, now because post the PNB fraud and the kind of strictures from the Reserve Bank of India, banks are again shying of lending. Retail lending might still be happening, but no banker wants to lend to large projects, particularly infrastructure projects. Is this something we need to be concerned about?
Yes, of course. I mean, of course we have to be concerned about the fact that something like PNB happened. I mean, that is the most important issue for us to keep in mind, that so far as the banking system is concerned, we were following all international rules, and everything that is India's reputation in the banking system was very high in the Basel Accord and all that sort of thing, that we had following, or all the international norms in terms of regulating the banks, in terms of cash reserve ratios and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it is of utmost importance, and PNB scandal, I mean, that is a, what you might say, an eye-opener, that this kind of a thing could happen over a period of number of years, I mean 3-4 years as it were, and that we were not able to handle it. This is one point. Second point is the NPAs have also been high for 3-4 years, and we should have been able to handle that part. But now, I think in the light of PNB as well as the, what you might say, the sense of crisis in the banking system, some new measures have been introduced, bankruptcy and insolvency law, as well as the Reserve Bank has introduced certain policies or wanting to introduce certain policies which make banks much more accountable than issuing letters of agreement and that sort of thing. So what I am saying essentially is that that PNB is a big lesson for the banking regulation of the banking system, and I am very glad that we have initiated measures both for capitalization, reducing NPAs, and for ensuring that banks conform to the best standards of monetary policy.
Desire to ensure that such things don't recur. When the regulator bans a certain instrument, is there a price that we pay in terms of reducing the scope for trade financing, which could hit us? Because after all, you know, frauds do occur, but they are one-off instances. And if in the process the regulator were to ban, would it not be akin to, say, banning credit cards just because there are some frauds in the credit card business? So is it not better supervision, more directed regulation and supervision the answer, rather than outright ban? I know I'm asking you to put, you know, putting you in a slightly dangerous spot, maybe given where you came from earlier. But my question really is that should we have a more nuanced approach rather than outright bans?
No, that you are right, absolutely. I mean, on that there can be no difference. In a technological age, we have to use technology. But we have to make sure that when we are using technology, like when you use your mobile phones, when you are using this camera and we are talking, I mean that we are all very careful in saying what we want to say and what we want to do. And there is a connectivity. So what I am trying to get to you is that there are, you know, it is not a question of choosing this or that. The only option that we have and we must stick to is the regulatory and a performance system which is transparent, which is supervised, and which conforms to the best rules in the world.
You also spoke,
and that can be done, by the way.
Yes, of course it can. But it's just the regulator all over the world, the regulator is always chasing the crooks. It's never the other way around, and that's part of the game. But if I were to focus attention now on the IBC, the bankruptcy code that you spoke about, there were very high hopes when the government passed that code. But the fact is that we're seeing that most of the cases are stuck in litigation at one point or the other. So is it that we also need to have a supporting ecosystem, and we also need judicial reforms, a better market for asset sales, and those kind of things? Unless that happens, we're not going to see the kind of progress that we were hoping when we passed the insolvency code.
No, but I mean, let us look at it this way, that you are right. I mean that our policy framework and our sort of timely implementation of all the policies that we announce is relatively weak, depending on the structure of our governmental system and the structure of parliament and judiciary and so on and so forth. Let's not go into that. But what I am trying to tell you and say is that irrespective of all this, we have performed very well in the past, and there is nothing to stop India from resuming or from doing what needs to be done in the banking sector, particularly financial sector. And the greatest advantage that we have is that we have the technology, we have the capital, and we have the consumer demand, as well as everything else that is needed in terms of job creation, and the government is also focusing on that. And that we should concentrate on these things where we are, we are able to achieve what we want to achieve in terms of growth, in terms of low inflation, in terms of jobs. And I don't see any conflict in that part in terms of our resources and management.
The PNB scam particularly, and of course the rising NPAs, there's been a clamor from many people, in fact, that it's time to move to privatize the public sector banks. I must confess and put my cards on the table, I'm not in that camp. I think you're comparing apples and oranges when you compare public sector banks with private sector banks, and as long as public sector banks answer to a different kind of mandate. It is really not correct to say that privatization is the answer. We've seen scams, we've seen NPAs in private sector banks also. Unlike other sectors, banking is one sector where it is always the taxpayer money, even in the case of private sector banks. So let me ask you, where do your sympathies lie? Is privatization an answer? And why is it that people who should know better argue that private sector banks do not cost taxpayer money? Two questions, sir, for you.
No, but I mean, you are absolutely right. You know, in the sense that if you look at the structure of our population, I mean, the very large number of people are in agricultural areas. Majority of the people live in agricultural areas, in rural areas, and so we need public sector banks to outreach. We need public sector bank to make it much more much more accessible to the largest number of population that we have in rural, semi-urban and other areas, and this can be done by by public sector banks. Now, the point that we have to concentrate on is the governance system. It's not public versus private. It is the governance system of public banks. And I hope after the PNB scandal that we will get into the governance system of public banks, that is it possible to have an arm's length relationship in governance of public sector banks from, say, ministries and also RBI, just as we do in regard to private sector banks. Private sector banks are supervised, private sector banks are regulated. So just let us ask ourselves. So it's not a question of public versus private. It's a question of governance, methodology, and making sure that accountability of public sector banks for performance is fully monitored by the regulatory authority. I don't think that we should do away with public sector banks or privatize them. I mean, because then who would lend to priority sector to the extent that we need to do? Who would do, for example, the public infrastructure? If it's not public infrastructure, roads, rural areas, that if you need financing of these things, then public sector banks are important. But it doesn't mean that the way we govern our public sector banks is the right governance system. Why should we allow NPAs to be where they were? And ask yourself, we handled the station crisis also, which nobody expected that we will. We had a balance of payments problem, we were in deep trouble, but we handled, and all through the public sector banks. So what I am saying is not public versus private that we should concentrate on. It is the governance system, it is the role of the government in deciding what the public sector banks should do. Why can't we simply have a board which is accountable, and the government's main responsibility is monitoring performance? Do you see what I mean?
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jalan, as well as Maithili ma'am, for taking us through this interesting